Okay, and the attendees are joining the session as we open up. Okay, welcome to this session, the second this morning, and this session is on pensions and the labour market experiences of older people. My name is Micheál Collins. I'm one of the presenters later, but I'm also one of the staff members here at UCD and at the Geary Institute for Public Policy as well, and we're delighted to co-host this conference alongside the NERI. We've got 4 papers ahead. The structure will be that speakers will speak for 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, I'll sort of nudge you to stop. If you could stop shortly after that. 2 or 3 minutes of questions and discussions, and then we'll move on to the next paper as well. So to get the ball rolling, the first paper on automatic enrolment, revisiting the original scheme, is from Jim Stewart from Trinity College. Jim, welcome, and off you go.
Thank you very much, Micheál. So good morning to everybody. Most people, or many people, may not be aware that the programme for government in May 2020 stated that a new automatic enrolment pension scheme will be introduced. And what's interesting is that this was not in the Fianna Fáil manifesto or the Green Party manifesto, it was in the Fine Gael manifesto. So an automatic enrolment proposal has been around for some time. It was first mooted or discussed in a Green paper in 2007, and in 2010 a framework document described in more detail what an automatic enrolment scheme would look like, the proposed scheme for Ireland. The first point to note is that it would be a funded DC type scheme. Essential features were that employees aged over 22 without pension coverage and with earnings over 18,000 would be automatically enrolled. There would be opt-out provisions. The total contribution would be 8%, and this would consist of 4% from employees, 2% from employers, and 2% from the state. There were variations on the 210 scheme announced in a roadmap on pensions in October 2018 and 2019. The age of enrolment was set at 23. The lowest limit for automatic enrolment was 20,000, and earnings above a maximum of 70,000 euros per annum would not qualify for the earnings contribution. Employee and employer contributions were set at each as a maximum of 6% of earnings. State contributions have yet to be decided and be rolled out over 10 years. So look, both proposals are very similar. There are some slight variations between them. The roadmap AE scheme is very similar to the original. That's the most recent one to the earlier proposal. But the reasons for introducing an AE scheme are somewhat different. Both proposals argue that pension savings are inadequate for slightly different reasons. The roadmap said it was because of an inertia. The more recent scheme, the earlier scheme said it was an inertia. The more recent scheme saying, framework document, the roadmap saying complexities and lack of confidence. Both reports have an policy objective of increasing private sector pension saving. Both reports state that concurrent with inadequate retirement savings, the social insurance state funding will face increasing risks and increasing deficits. Now, actuarial reviews of the social insurance fund have linked changing demographic structures to the viability of state old age pensions, although it should be noted that forecast deficits have proved very inaccurate. For example, the Social Security Fund was 1.4 billion in surplus in 2019. In 2010, the actuarial review said there would be a deficit of 3 billion. In 2015, actuarial review said there would be no deficit, it would be just in balance. It's likely, though, that for 2020, there will be a large deficit because of the COVID-19 crisis. The framework document, the more recent document, the earlier document, 2010 document, the framework document, states that introducing an AE scheme would increase coverage and adequacy. The more recent document has several references to coverage, but very little reference to adequacy. There's no reference in relation to automatic enrolment scheme and adequacy. Now, evidence from the UK shows that following the introduction of an AE scheme, coverage certainly increased, but contribution rates fell to 5% in 2018. That's the most recent data compared with 9.7% when it was first introduced in 2012. It's also interesting to note that the amount saved is very small per average. Average amount saved in the scheme in 2018 was very small at £5,000 sterling. And I don't know quite why it's so small, but obviously this raises issues with the adequacy of pensions. So the point is, while the reasons for introducing an EE scheme, a key point is, have remained broadly similar, key assumptions underlying the proposed EE pension scheme have changed substantially. So I have some worked examples, which will be in my slides, but I won't go through them now. That if you assume from the original scheme that there's a 7%, if the scheme assumed there'd be a 7% return net of costs, 40 years contributions, and the total contribution would be 8% per annum. So after 40 years, the total sum is 698,000, and the pension, assuming some sort of conversion ratio of 24 or whatever, would be 29,000. Very reasonable. But if it's assumed that the returns are not 7% per annum, but 1% per annum net of costs, and that rather than being a linear growth in the fund, there are periodic falls. So if we make an assumption that there's a 12% fall every 10 years, then the value of the accumulated fund after 40 years falls to 113,000. It's 40 years, the earlier example was 698,000, so it falls to 113,000. And the annual pension is about 4,700 using the same assumptions. The total value of contributions is less than the accumulated sum. But from the employee's perspective, the total value of the employee's contributions is less than the accumulated sum. So the accumulated sum is larger than the employee's contributions under those assumptions.
Jim, I'm just going to come in here just to say you're not sharing any slides in case you want to share slides.
I'm going to share some slides now, Micheál. I hope this works okay. So I just want to question, to raise the issue, is it reasonable to assume a 1% return? Now here I'll try and share some slides with you. I hope this works okay.
There's a share screen option on the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, I pressed that, but I can't see my slides. Okay, what do I get out of this?
If you open your slides first, they should be accessible.
I have them open now, unfortunately, Micheál, but let's just try this again.
We have a copy of your slides, Jim. Do you want us to put them up for
you?
you?
See this? Can you see what I have there?
No.
No. Okay. Sorry about this. So look, maybe I'll just try and return to the page.
Jim, I'm happy to open up the set of slides you sent on. Do you want me to do that so that?
I'll very quickly find the slides. Sorry.
There you are. Paul has done that. So there you go. You can just tell us what to move through, and we'll.
So if you go to, I think it might be slide 10. Just flash on down. That's it. That's the slide there.
Go.
Now that slide shows the 10-year bond for various Eurozone countries, and you can see that the 10-year return on German government bonds has been negative for some time. It's minus 3.79%. Similarly, it has bounced around zero for the Irish government. So looking at returns on 10-year government bonds, then I think 1% is a reasonable assumption. Now, if we go on to the next slide, is volatility. Is that a reasonable assumption? Going to continue on, Micheál? There we go. So that shows the index, the ISEC index for Ireland compared with the Netherlands. Now, you might expect volatility, the Irish index, but it's very similar to the Netherlands index. And you go to the next slide, Micheál, thank you. This shows that for the same 25-year period for the French index and the UK index, again, showing extreme volatility. Now, the point about extreme volatility is associated with very high risk. So I've assumed in my worked example that there's a 10-year return, 12% fall after every decade, after 10 years. So this shows extreme volatility. So I'll just make some conclusions now. So a funded automatic pension scheme is not a solution for many of those without pension coverage, because returns are low compared with initial projected returns of 7% per annum, and are likely to remain low to ECB policies. Risk due to volatility is high. So you have low returns, high risk. For employees with low pay, variable work history, or periods of unemployment, and frequent changes in employers, AE-type schemes are unlikely to provide adequate supplementary pensions to those currently without pension coverage. Costs for proposed AE schemes are likely to be large. For example, administration of AE schemes and the cost of proposed central processing authority. The cost of fiscal incentives and the cost associated with management funds will also be high. Now, it's proposed to cap the cost of managing funds at 0.5%, but this will exclude trading costs. So for these reasons, I'd suggest that the automatic enrolment scheme is not appropriate for the people that has raised that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jim, and thank you for that insight into that evolving public policy area. Let me just have a few comments and questions for you. Let me get the ball rolling on that then. I suppose the current crisis that we're in, and we have very strong signals from all the central banks and so on, that bond yields will stay, or government bond yields will stay low for quite some time, and interest rates will be low for the foreseeable future. So this issue clearly is going to persist. And the risk of stock market volatility is very obvious as well. So where does that lead us, Jim, in terms of thinking about, say, alternatives to this pathway? And are there other ways that we can reduce the risk and exposure for individuals for their pension savings?
Yes, I think a fundamental issue, I would say an error, but fundamental issue is that when discussing automatic enrolment, it was always assumed that it would be funded. You could have an automatic enrolment scheme which was not funded. It could be notionally funded, but it would still be a function of your contributions and period of payment in and whatever, but not necessarily tied to funded schemes. Now, can I just say too, it may also be the case that pension fund returns are not just related to stock market volatility, but there's likely to be some connection because stock market volatility is often quite highly correlated with other asset changes. So I think it could be one solution, a less riskier solution would be not to have it funded, but to have it a notional contribution, so that it was tied in, the returns could be set and they were tied in to the number of contributions and the period. So it's still defined contribution, but not necessarily tied into the volatility associated with stock markets and other assets.
And Jim, a comment from one other participant, Killian Doherty, asks, if we assume that we're stuck in a world of low interest rates for the foreseeable future, how likely are 7% returns? Are these returns not wildly optimistic?
7% returns are wildly optimistic. Do not forget, these returns are net of costs. So the gross return might be 9 or 10%. Even in 2010, when it was first mooted, this was a wildly optimistic assumption to make. I think low returns are quite likely to be here to stay. There might be more than 1%. You could get higher returns, but associated with higher returns, there's much greater risk. And certainly in the current crisis, I think risk is going to remain high.
And it's interesting, I suppose, when you think about states, and this state is a particularly good example of it, but it's clearly in the interest of states who are now accumulating large amounts of debt given the current crisis, and will do so probably over next year as well, that it's almost really important fiscally for those countries to have low bond yields for the foreseeable future to make that debt manageable. So there's a sort of inbuilt incentive for governments to keep these returns low as well.
There is, yes, but at the same time, I mean, it really makes the whole viability of a funded pension scheme very difficult. It's very difficult with low returns to accumulate a sufficient fund to provide an adequate pension in retirement. This is very difficult indeed, yeah.
And one final question then, given the existing pressures on the state pension system, does an unfunded system not further increase pressures on the SIF, that's the Social Insurance Fund, and on the Exchequer?
It does, but the essence of the issue is which is the best way to provide funded pensions, pay as you go or funded, because in the final analysis, pensions can only be paid from future output. Pensions can only come from the output of future employees. You can't put loaves of bread in the ground. So it's a question, which is the most efficient in terms of delivering a future stream of income to future retired persons, pay as you go or funding. I mean, they both have issues with demographic change, but I would argue that a funded system has inherent risks and also can be much more expensive to operate than a pay-as-you-go system, such as the current Social Security system.
Okay, Jim, thank you very much. Really interesting.
Apologize again for making a mess of my slides.
No, that's okay. That we have all sorts of backups which worked.
Thank you very much, Micheál. Thank you.
Well, so thanks, Jim, for that. And we move on to the second paper in the session, and it's from Dr. Catherine Elliott O'Dare from the Geary Institute at UCD, and Catherine's going to speak on researching older people and low pay. So welcome, Catherine, and off you go.
I'd like to say we're delighted to be here. While I am presenting on this research, it is a joint paper with Micheál, our panel here. And can you see me? There you go. It is a joint paper with Micheál and also with Professor Philip O'Connell. The research also is funded by the Low Pay Commission. So what I'm going to talk about today, first of all, I'd like to emphasize that it is new research. So we have only commenced the research. I'm going to give you a brief outline of the focus and, you know, where the idea came from and the impetus came from to pursue this research. As I said, we just commenced and, you know, our provisional final date for this is March or April of next year. I'm going to look at the intended outcomes. Before I start, I just want to define some terms because, you know, they can be a bit ambiguous. So I'll define low pay in the next slide, and also older people. I would like to say also, you know, the concept of older is contested. So there's lots of different ways about thinking about who's old, and there's no broad real agreement. But for the purposes of this research, we're going to use the age classification of 55 and older. The reason we do that is because it aligns with present studies by the ESRI, also aligns with the CSO recent report on labour force and the survey there, and also it's going to give us kind of broader parameters to work with in relation to sampling. So just in relation to the low pay, really when we look at wage levels, we look at high and low pay, and low pay, the instance of low pay refers to people you know, who are and this is the OECD definition, the share of workers earning less than 2/3 of the median income. And there's various thresholds there that I'm sure you're all familiar with. The OECD is €12.20 an hour, national minimum wage, €10.10, and of course the living wage recommended is €12.30 per hour. So just to set the context in relation to what I'm going to talk about. Also in relation to context, I think what's most fascinating, especially in relation to looking at older people and older workers, is this, you know, this change in demographic dividend. I mean, people are working longer, they're living longer, they're healthier for longer, and this is unprecedented, you know, in history that we have this marvelous dividend. I know there are people who and researchers who will focus probably on the demographic burden, and you know, that makes a valuable contribution. but we'd like to just balance that up by focusing on the demographic dividend. So when I talk about that, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the wonderful research from Tilda, and they have provided us with evidence that demonstrates that older people, you know, contribute widely and broadly to their community through voluntary work. A lot of charities and charitable organizations depend on this demographic. Also, there's evidence to show that older people, that transfers go down through generations, so that a lot of older people make significant contributions to their families and their children financially, and this goes down through the generations. Other considerations are the extended working lives. There's lots of great research being performed throughout Ireland in relation to extended working lives. So people having the choice or not, or choosing, or, you know, involuntary pursuing work lives and careers beyond what would traditionally have been enforced retirement ages. So, you know, there's this demographic dividend provides, I think, a marvelous context for older workers. And, you know, even some of the previous presenters referred to the care burden. And there's evidence, again, lots of evidence to suggest that older people contribute to care and care provision for partners and spouses, for children, grandchildren, and sometimes both. So this notion of, you know, this squeeze middle, I suppose. So the longevity economy, you know, what people are older people now, how they spend their money, how they earn it. For the first time, you know, in the labour force, we have a really broad multi-generational workforce. So we have younger and older workers working together. And this in itself is very interesting in the low pay context. Of course, older workers, you know, are a homogenous group, so there's lots of different variables, which Micheál will look at in the data as well, in the quantitative data, and we'll see that. And I suppose the emphasis here is that there is a large presence of low pay in Ireland, and there are significant knowledge gaps there, and I'll talk about that in a slide, how Micheál identified that. And then, of course, all of us are aware, how could we not be, of the COVID-19 health pandemic. So that provided some challenges for us, and I'll talk about those in relation to the qualitative analysis. So just some statistics, 1 in 5 people resident in Ireland will be 65 years or older, and 20% of the Irish workforce are aged, and this was last year from the ESRI. So I think you can see why the context is very relevant to low pay. Research conducted by Micheál was actually the impetus for this thinking around this new approach and this new research. Micheál had analysed data, and what he identified that the age group most at risk of low pay were younger people. But what was interesting, you know, after that dip, then that the risk of low pay increased again for employees. The age classification on this research was 60 and plus, so that's why we see the 60 plus here. So this was interesting here, this increase then in older age. And the question, or the puzzle that this presented then, was why this was so. You know, what were the contexts, or what were the conditions, the variables, the factors that contributed to this increased risk, and were they voluntary, involuntary, you know, and why did it happen, basically? So asking this why question. So in order to do that, we have a research agenda and questions, and broadly, as I said, the why question. Why do older people enter and remain in low paid employment? Lots of other interesting questions to ask there. Who are they? So who are these older people? What are the characteristics and the variables that propel or keep them in low pay? Push and pull factors, referring again to the research earlier, some really, really interesting research presented there about the gender dimension of people, men and women in work. And we wonder, will this emerge in relation to low pay workers? So will there be a gender dimension there? As I said, we're going to look at the 55 age group and over, and we recognize, of course, that while there are some shared characteristics, it's inevitable that they are a group with very, very varying characteristics and variables and experiences. So we're going to look at the lived experiences, and this is the added dimension that we add to the quant research, is this notion of a lived experience and the voices of older workers themselves recounting their experiences and maybe raising issues that hasn't appeared in the data, the existing data so far, and then also asking, well, what, if any, are the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on older workers in low pay? In order to do this and to look at these questions, we're going to take a mixed methods approach. Of course, we could have chosen either or, went in one direction, but the reason that this was chosen was because we hope that it'll give us a really broad insight into the data and into these experience, maybe a more comprehensive understanding than would be if we used one of these methods alone. The data involved is the SILT survey data from 2018, which is available now and Micheál has started to work on. For the qualitative approach, we're going to use semi-structured interviews, phone and online, and I'll talk a bit about that.
That's Catherine.
Yeah.
2 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Micheál. So in relation to the survey data, Micheál will analyse the data in relation to the individual profiles. So what he will look at will be individual variables, report hourly rates, a detailed classification and tabulation in relation to these variables. For example, are these workers, is their income the sole income in the family, a secondary income, additional income? Is it choice? Is it involuntary? How important other variables are, such as medical card, living standards? So lots to look at there. In relation to the qualitative approach, we're going to sample for men and women aged 55 years and older throughout Ireland. 25 to 40 interviews. We had originally intended focus groups, but that's not going to happen now with the COVID. So we're going to do online and phone interviews, semi-structured one-to-one. So we'll start off with some questions, and then as the interviews go on, we'll see how the what people talk about in one interview will inform the questions asked in the next interview, and also in relation to the quantitative data. We are conscious of a digital divide, so accessibility of Wi-Fi and smartphones, and maybe issues around older people, which I have to say is unsupported. Older people are very engaged in technology, and we'll take that into consideration. Okay, so just to conclude, as we say, it's new research that we've just commenced. What we hope it'll do is fill this dearth in research in Ireland on low-paid workers and the lived experiences. We want to provide, and we hope we'll provide, by using the quant and qual approach, the mixed methods, a detailed insight and understanding of older people in low pay. And, this cohort is expected to grow in the years to come. So we'd like to see and get an understanding of the context and the choices that these older people are making. And the findings, we hope, will be available in March or April, and we hope that the policy makers will find them useful, that we can make contribution with the research to low pay policy, to broader labour market policy, and on active ageing. And hopefully we'll be back next year. Micheál can present the findings, I'm sure. We can look forward to that. So thank you for your time. Any questions?
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks for that. Obviously, I'm biased, but it's an interesting, evolving research project, and nice to signal that as well. A few questions have come in. If we can get to them briefly. The first, there are obvious pre-pandemic data, but or these rather are obviously pre-pandemic data, but do you see any particular issues for these workers as the depression in activity continues, their concentration in particular sectors, some risk factors for employment transitions and so on, which I suppose frames that just in that overall COVID context for carrying out research like this?
I would say absolutely. I mean, there's quite a large body of research emerging at the moment in the UK and here and throughout Europe about the impacts. The sectors that we hope to look at, we anticipate will engage with those kind of questions. We plan to look at, the retail sector, services sector. So yeah, we envisage that COVID context. We actually added this on originally, before COVID. This wouldn't have been a consideration, but we expect, particularly in relation to the talk data, I'd say quite a number of workers will naturally talk about COVID and the influence and experiences of that.
Yeah, and yes, COVID certainly for any current research project, certainly when they have this qualitative aspect, is is a really intriguing context. So it'll be interesting to see that evolve. And one comment I'll just make again from Sarah, who's about to present, but she said it might be worth considering the work history data is available in Share and Tilde, showing people switching sector when taking post-work retirement. And that speaks, I think, to some of those interesting questions about why is it that people end up undertaking low pay, and so those certainly are, I think, useful sources. Excellent, Catherine. Thank you very much for your presentation and for sticking to the time. And we go on to the third paper in this session, and it's from Dr. Sarah Gibney from IGEES and the Department of Health. And Sarah is going to speak on ageism and perceived job sustainability, a comparative European analysis. Welcome, Sarah. I'll come in after 10 minutes to nudge you towards stopping, and just to flag to those who are participating and attending that you can use the question and answer function if you've got questions, which I'm happy to pick up at the end and ask Sarah. So all yours, Sarah.
Great, thank you very much. It's a great opportunity to speak to you today, so I hope you've enjoyed the conference so far. I'm going to speak to you about a paper that was conducted as part of the Healthy and Positive Aging Initiative, which is a research initiative established to support the implementation of the National Positive Aging Strategy. The strategy had 3 pillars: security, participation, and healthy aging. And also a cross-cutting issue was combating ageism. So this research is very much conducted to inform that. So I'll just give you a brief overview. Bear with me. So in terms of the background, I'm going to go through the background, the methodology, just some key results. I can share the paper afterwards, and discussion and conclusion. The background is really probably everything that we've already spoken about, and we know that the expected duration of working life in a person's lifetime has increased. There's lots of countries who are aiming to retain older workers and extend retirement ages, re-engaging older workers through different strategies and policies: positive aging, active aging, healthy aging. These are all affirmative policies that are around the globe. There's also efforts to improve work sustainability across the life course and into older age. And this is a policy priority for economic reasons and also for health and well-being reasons. So in Ireland, I've mentioned we have the positive aging strategy, so focusing in on efforts to improve the working conditions of older workers, looking at age-friendly workplaces, flexible work practices, gradual retirement options, and pre-retirement planning. Why do we really care about ageism, and why do we think it's important for the economy and for society? There's a lot of research from health and well-being, and from the Tilde data set, which shows really that socially, if ageism is ingrained, it becomes internalized, a self-fulfilling prophecy. It can lead to social isolation, reduced physical activity, cognitive decline, and in terms of the labour market, it can impact on productivity, perceived self-efficacy. So this is quite damaging for both the individual and also for the economy and for society. So it's harmful and it needs to be addressed. So the purpose of this study was really to build on a research gap that we'd identified. So there's lots of studies out there that describe the labour market and economic challenges that are faced by older workers. Eurofound, using the data that I'll talk to you today, have previously looked at the relationship between working conditions and job quality and perceived work sustainability, but they didn't look at ageism as one of those conditions. So that's what we really wanted to focus in on in this paper. In terms of the methodology, we used the 6th round of the European Working Conditions Survey. This is a very rich data set which captures an enormous amount of information about the working conditions. So it runs every 4 years. It's been going since 1990. The current wave is out in the field. The analytic sample that we're looking at is people aged 40 to 70, and they're currently in paid employment. So they've been in paid employment for at least 1 year in this particular sample. We have a sample of just over 22,000. The dependent variable that we're interested in, so this is a specific yes/no variable in the data set. So this is, do you think you can do the same job or similar until the age of 60, or if you're aged 56 or older in the next 5 years? So this is our perceived job sustainability indicator. In terms of factors that may impact on this outcome, I'll go through a number of different indices that we've used. They're grouped into kind of coherent families. So work satisfaction is the first one. This is a single index that was constructed by Eurofound. So this covers things, these different items here. So it really captures just people's perceptions of the environment that they're working in. In terms of workplace environment, more specifically, there's 6 different indices that we've included. So capturing physical, work intensity, time quality, the social environment, skills and discretion, and engagement as well with the workplace and their role. In terms of other measures, we have controlled for age and gender and attainment of third level of education. We've included characteristics of current jobs, so sector, firm size, occupation, and seniority as well. And then in terms of health and well-being, we've controlled for self-assessed health. So again, whether people think they're in very good, or fair, bad, or very bad health. Physical illness as well as being distinct from that more global measure of health. A well-being index, which is how people have felt in the past 5 weeks, and also sleep difficulties, because we know that does impact on performance and well-being as well. So it's all there in the data set. So as I said, it's an enormously rich data set and really important different tools to have there. We also know that the prevalence of ageism across the EU 28 member states varies quite a bit, and it's also influenced by different external factors, so culture, legislation, and the social and economic conditions in that country. So on this basis, we grouped member states into 6 different regimes based on the employment sustaining policies and flexibility. You can see them set out here. Everyone looks for Ireland straight away. We're there at the time. This is 2016 data, so we're in the liberal category along with the UK. So how did we approach this? So we've got multi-level data. So we've got workers nested within firms and within institutional arrangements, so labour market regimes. And we've got an enormous amount of data with different attributes and characteristics. So we used generalized structural equation modeling to test the relationship and modeling ageism and perceived job sustainability, that yes/no question, as the outcome. So as I said, GSEM is really the most appropriate here, given the cross-sectional nature of the data, the different types of outcomes that we have, the multi-level structure, and we can estimate different models, and we have multiple observed variables and different modeling techniques at play. So I'll walk you through the equations now. So as I say, we're running simultaneous models here. So we have 3 different equations. So the first equation, we're modeling perceived job sustainability as the outcome. This is a logit model, and it's capturing things as being a function of age discrimination, the demographic characteristics, the current job, employment regime, and health and work satisfaction. In the second equation, we are looking at health as being a function of physical illness, poor mental well-being, sleep difficulties, and this is again using a logit model. The third equation in the simultaneous model is work satisfaction. So this is the function of the environment, the physical, the intensity, the time quality, engagement. And again, this isn't a logit model, this is a Gaussian model in this instance because we are dealing with a normally distributed index from 0 to 100. So in terms of the main results, not overwhelmingly shocking really here, but we're seeing some differences here in terms of sustainability initially in the bivariate analysis. So we see people who have, when we're looking at the workplace indicators, the scores are lower for workers who've experienced ageism. In terms of the demographic and job attributes, older age and being in a larger business is more common among those who've experienced ageism as well. In terms of health and well-being, we see in these bivariate results that rates of poor health and well-being are higher for workers who've experienced ageism as well. But we need to get to the model and those controls that I spoke about. So what we see in this baseline model is that yes, if people have experienced ageism, they're less likely to perceive, to have good perception of work sustainability. And it's comparable, just a little bit lower in that baseline model to the impact of self-assessed health. That's without controlling for those employment regimes. When we control for the employment regime, it holds, and it's still comparable to self-assessed health. And then just as a sensitivity analysis, robustness check, we controlled for people who are employees only, so excluding people who are self-employed, and we see that the model holds as well. So just in terms of those key findings, we found that ageism in the workplace ranged from, so it's quite low, just to say, it ranged from 1.8% in post-socialist liberal regimes to just over 4% in social democratic regimes. The perceived job sustainability indicator was higher in the social democratic regime, it was highest in that regime. In the baseline model, ageism does show significant negative correlation with perceived job sustainability. It's comparable to the impact of health status. And those results hold when we control for employment regimes and restrict the models to those employees only. There are some challenges with this type of analysis and with its data. So first of all, as I flagged, it's cross-sectional. So there's certainly the case that there may be potential indigeneity. Also, the self-assessed health indicator may contain some biased estimates, impacted by unobservable personal characteristics or other things going on, and which may impact on that assessment. But by using this particular type of model, we've controlled for physical and psychological health as well to adjust for as much as we can. It may be, certainly the case that if you have the opportunity to include objective health assessments, that would be a strength in a model like this in the future. Also, one of our reviewers pointed out that the measure of ageism is conceptually and operationally quite narrow in this analysis. We are limited by what's available in the data set. There's also the potential of reverse causality. We couldn't control for that. But we have control for things in the wider social environment, support from managers and colleagues as well. So we're really trying to hone in and narrow the impact of that limited measure. But I suppose in terms of perception, whether the person experienced ageism or not, if they feel they have, it will have a negative impact on their behaviors and their experience. So, a perception is very much real in this type of social environment. Just in terms of the discussion and concluding remarks.
1 minute now, Sarah.
Within the context of increasing expected duration of working life, a lot of people hold very positive expectations to remaining in the workforce, and that's really important and they need to support it. The experience of ageism is something that is very real and does negatively impact on this perception. So we've built on quite a bit of literature around workplace environment. The policies to extend retirement age and supporting active aging should really include efforts to combat ageism in the workplace. But just acknowledge that this work was conducted under the Healthy and Positive Aging Initiative, and if you want to read the full paper, the citation and the link is there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. That's really interesting, a paper and insight into a fascinating topic. Let me, just a few comments and questions, or at least a discussion to have from it. Firstly, I might get you to say just a tiny bit more about the data you're using here, which I think you mentioned was from Eurofound, and just in a sense the nature of that in terms of its cross-country structure. And then secondly, can you it struck me listening to that it might be interesting, I don't know if you've done this in the paper, to profile those who are of the opinion that their future careers beyond 60 is not sustainable. And so, you know, who are they? And then does that trigger some issues for labour market policy broadly in the way in which we might respond to those people? Often it's their period of highest earnings, and it's when we expect them to be putting most aside for their retirement and so on as well.
Okay, so just on the first point, the Eurofound data, so this is the European Working Conditions Survey. It's conducted every 4 years. It is current workers or people in the labour market. And it's hugely comprehensive in capturing aspects of both from the worker perspective, and there's also an adjoining survey of businesses and employees as well. So the European Company Survey. So those two data sets can work quite nicely together. So it captures the workplace environment and also all of the labour market variables that you typically expect in a labour market survey, but with the addition of those, you know, health and well-being indicators and personal perspectives. So I think it's very useful. It is it's rounds as opposed to waves, so it's not panel data, but there are techniques that you can use if you want to use those kind of trends. So it has complete coverage of the European member states. And they produce topical reports along with the data every year, and it's publicly available, so you can download it and go. They actually have a very accessible website as well if you want to do some basic analysis as well. In terms of profiling those who say that that they don't think they can keep working, yeah, absolutely. You've got a huge number of individual characteristics, their sector, their working conditions, and so I think there certainly is probably a very descriptive piece to be done. And we touched on that a little bit in the paper, but not in a huge amount. But yeah, absolutely, it's there.
Okay, we'll stop there, Sarah. Thank you very much. That's a really interesting paper and very interesting insight into you know, fascinating aspects of the labour market, and so really worth hearing exactly what a conference like this is about. So thank you for that contribution as well. And I know at the end of this conference that the NERI will be making not just the recordings of these sessions, but also the slides where possible available, and so people will be able to pick up the link to Sarah's paper via that as well. Okay, and so on to the final paper of the session, and that is a paper from myself. So I have to make sure I don't speak for too long when I'm chairing myself, and it's a paper with the title of The Poverty and Inequality Effects of Pensions. And there are five aspects to my presentation on this paper. So firstly, briefly on the research question that this research is trying to cover. And then just very briefly on why I am looking at and have pursued this as a research question. Briefly on the data and the methods that are being used here. And then reflecting some of the earlier papers too, you know, this is work in progress, so there are some initial results, and I just want to sort of point towards those. They point towards some potential further steps for this research as well, and then I'll be moving to think about those, and indeed I'm open to some suggestions on that as well. But let me start with the research question here under this sort of heading of the poverty and inequality effects of pensions. So I suppose when we think about pensions and pensions policy, you know, quite clearly stated and articulated a lot of the time that, you know, a core objective of pensions policy is poverty avoidance, and indeed the pension system does a pretty good job, as we'll see shortly, at achieving that. Or at least does currently. It probably has varied quite dramatically over time, but currently that's the case. A core objective of the redistribution system is poverty avoidance as well. but I suppose there are less direct focuses on inequality, certainly when we're thinking about pensions, and that's where I've been steering this paper. You know, it's implicit in the objectives of decreasing poverty, but nonetheless I thought it was interesting to ask a question which wrapped in the inequality aspect as well as the poverty aspect as well. And so therefore that's where the research question for this work comes from. How effective are Ireland's existing pension policy tools at reducing poverty and inequality? Now, it's existing tools, pension policy tools that we're looking at here. So Jim spoke earlier of you know, the directions for potential new policy tools, and there are other alternative avenues frequently presented around the way in which we could change or alter pension policy. For now, I am just taking what we have and looking at those effects. I suppose at the back of my head, and why I wanted to highlight the word existing there, one clearly could begin to think about simulating future potential pension policies and look at what they might do. And I know indeed there's been some work in that area to date. Why ask this question and why pursue something like this? Well, let me start from where I'm coming from on this, with you know, an interest in the inequality effects, particularly of taxation measures, and there'll be some interesting there's some very interesting literature out there on that, and last year or two some interesting work. I noted some quite useful work from the National Statistics Office, the NSO in the UK, which was looking at issues around this. I thought it might be interesting to broaden things out to the other wing of redistribution. So, you know, we ask frequently questions around inequality and taxation measures, and I thought it might be interesting just to broaden that out to look at welfare measures, and specifically to look at some state pension aspects because of how important that is as part of the pension system. So it's there as well. But I also wanted to comprehensively look at the overall pensions landscape as well. Jim Stewart, who you heard from earlier, and others, part of a pensions policy research group. So we talk frequently about sort of pension research issues. And so this, I suppose, asking that question reflects an underlying interest in that topic as well. So maybe it's a bit of a pensions detour from an interest in the inequality effects of various redistribution measures, because it's redistribution plus when we look at all of the other aspects of the pension system as well. I didn't put it on the slide. I suppose the other interesting aspect of why this is a relevant question to ask relates to the policy context, the current policy context too. So if we look at the most recent program for government, we've got you know, commitments to re-examine the taxation system in there, for examinations of aspects of the welfare system, for a commitment to a more closer examination of the pensions system as well. So a lot of these topics, perhaps not joined immediately up together, but a lot of those topics are out there in the policy landscape currently, and I suppose some of this work will be, and the implications of it will be talking to that as well. The data I'm using here is relying on the excellent SILK data from the Central Statistics Office. So I've taken their microdata file that they lodged with the Social Science Data Archive here at UCD, and used it for this analysis. I'm going to talk about 2017. I'll come back about broadening that towards the end of the presentation. Just over 5,000 households, just over 12,500 individuals covered by that really useful survey. Complements the earlier presentation this morning from Sean from the CSO on that, the fascinating new administrative data that's coming out of the CSO, and of course that feeds into this survey with the feeds from the Department of Employment Affairs, Social Protection and Revenue to give you some quite strong income information in here in the survey, which really does lend to the robustness of the survey for doing analysis like this. And of course then you have the added value, as Sean mentioned earlier, of having the various characteristics of individuals and households, which makes some of the analysis and more detailed analysis possible. A few years ago, Jerry Hughes and I, in some work, looked at the robustness of the SILT data for doing pensions analysis, comparing the outcomes that you generate from that data with the Revenue Commissioner costing figures and so on as well. And it does a pretty good job, so comfortable in terms of using it. And then the pension tools available to be examined here. I've sort of split into two, so looking at the poverty and inequality effects of work-related pensions, and they split into two then. There are private pensions, in other words, occupational pensions, and personal pensions like PRSAs and other pensions that people are drawing down. And then there are state occupational pensions, so the pensions received by former state workers, former teachers, former nurses, and so on, who are retired and receiving a pension from as linked to their occupation from the state. So two chunks of work-related pensions, and then looking at social welfare pensions, and two aspects to that as well. Looking at the old age pension, and then also looking at the survivor's pension or the widow or widower's pension. Old age pension clearly flowing to people from 65, 66 upwards, whereas the survivor's pension you can get at any age. It triggers or is triggered by widowhood. Just in terms of the two bits of the analysis here on the inequality side, I'm using the Gini coefficient quickly on that, running from 0 to 100. The higher the number, the greater the level of inequality. And what I'm doing here is isolating the standalone effect of each policy measure on the Gini coefficient measure. So formally that's described as a Reynolds-Slemensky index. In plain English, what that means is we're calculating the impact of the policy measure by calculating the Gini with it and the Gini without it. And the difference between the two gives you a figure for the inequality effect of that policy measure. In the poverty side of things, a similar approach, looking with and without each of these pension tools. I will report the poverty risk, so the proportion of the population below the poverty line, the poverty gap, so how far on average people are below that line, and the poverty count, the number of people who are below that line as well. So briefly then, the initial results from this, as mentioned, using the 2017 SILC data, and then doing, I've in a sense generated the baseline position there, which is what's published as part of that report, and then I've also generated, well, what the outcomes would be without any pensions, and then looking at simulations starting in a sense from those baselines. So to work through that quickly then, so the published results from the SILC survey for Ireland in 2017, 15.7% of the population in poverty. The Gini coefficient stood at 31.5. About 750,000 people were in poverty, and on average they sat €56 a week below the poverty line. And then we can look at, well, if you took pensions away, what would it be? And then, so there were no pensions at all. Well, then you get that set of figures. 29% of people would be in poverty, be higher levels of inequality. There'd be almost 1.4 million people below the poverty line. And on average, they'd be quite far below the poverty line, €125 a week. Not surprising if you take away the entire system for that. So then the simulations are to look at, well, relative to that no pensions baseline, what's the case? Well, if you put all the pensions in, which is the difference between the top two, you get the figures which are in a sense just spoken about. How about if we do it for the two areas that I'm looking at? Firstly, for work-related pensions, well, work-related pensions reduce the level of poverty by 3.5 percentage points. They reduce the Gini coefficient by 1.7 percentage points. They take 165,000 people out of poverty, and they shrink the depth of poverty for the others by €15.50 a week. If we look into that, the action there is on the occupational state pensions. That's mainly what's happening. Put that another way, private pensions are really quite a small part of the system. They lift about 12,000 people out of poverty, and they have really quite a small effect on poverty and on inequality overall. And then the other side of the system are the social welfare pensions. Overall in the pension system, not unsurprising, it is the social welfare system that drives the poverty and inequality effects of pensions. So the social welfare pensions combined reduce the level of poverty by 9%. They decrease inequality by 9 percentage points. They decrease inequality by 5 percentage points. They lift 435,000 people out of poverty, and they shrink the poverty gap by €43 a week. And then within that, unsurprisingly, the survivor's benefit is really quite small. There are small numbers of widows and widowers who are drawing social welfare or social insurance entitlements, and therefore most of that is being driven by old age pensions and the reduction in inequality and poverty deriving from those as well. So that's really the kind of the first bash at calculations for this. I'm open to suggestions, hence the logic of coming to a conference like this to present it. The plan from here on in is to expand this across multiple years of the silk, so that we begin to look at sort of average effects rather than one-off effects. A bit like Sarah in the previous paper, one of the challenges here is cross-sectional data, so it's just year on year, but we can at least look at some of those effects over time to see if they differ or what they average out across years. The 2018 data has arrived, so it's possible to expand it to that. I think it might be interesting to look at the poverty indicators above and below particular age threshold levels, and so, for example, above 65, above 70, and so on as well. I think there are obvious gender differences in here which are worth pursuing as well, and all of that is in my bundle for further work to do in 2020. So I'm going to stop there and stop sharing my screen if I can. Yeah, that's okay. And open it to questions and any comments on that. It's hard to ask questions when you are the chair of your own session. So maybe I won't try and do that, because it's a bit awkward to ask yourself a question and answer it as well. I could plant questions for myself. That might be a bit unfair. So why don't we bring the session to a close there, because we're supposed to stop. People are supposed to have an opportunity to grab lunch, so we'll give you a chance to do that. Can I thank each of the contributors for this session, to Jim, to Catherine, to Sarah, for their contributions as well. The link to the next session has been put into the chat function, so you can pick up on that. It's due to commence at 1 o'clock, and it's a session on differentiated labour markets and distributional issues, with 5 papers to be presented in that. So enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you for that after lunch. Bye-bye.